I'm really happy. I'm really happy because my friend Lucie White is here. She is a doctor in philosophy, did her PhD at NAU, Australia National University. Then we actually met in Hanover. She spent quite a few years there working with ethicists and philosophers of science. So she really works at the intersection of the two fields on this really fascinating area of crisis ethics, what to do in times of crisis and catastrophes. So, and now she is an assistant professor at Utrecht University. So delighted that you've made it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here. So today I wanted to talk to you about an idea that I've been working on with Matthias Frisch from the Leibniz University, Hannover. And basically we spent a lot of time during the COVID pandemic thinking about justifications for lockdown. And we were particularly interested really in the earliest stages of lockdown. So think back to March 2020, the first time that we really imposed lockdowns. And it was clear we sort of had some evidence to suggest that if we didn't take these really drastic measures, we could face through catastrophic consequences. But the evidence, particularly at this time, was highly uncertain. So we could see, that there were some things, possibilities we should take seriously on the horizon. What would happen if we failed to take action? But we really weren't in a position where we could even estimate how likely these sort of worst case scenarios were. So we've been thinking about this, and we've written a couple of papers coming at this from different angles. But today I want to present you with something a bit different that we've been thinking about for a while, and that is whether the precautionary principle might be able to provide some sort of justification here. So the precautionary principle, just in sort of most basic form, is basically the idea that uncertainty, and so by uncertainty here I really mean a situation in which we can't estimate the probabilities of various outcomes. Uncertainty shouldn't stop us from acting to prevent severe or catastrophic harm. So you see the precautionary principle invoked in other debates in public policy quite frequently to justify action. For example, in climate change, it's often held, look, there might be these sort of truly worst case catastrophic scenarios. We might not be able to really estimate how likely these are to obtain if we fail to take certain actions, but because they're just so terrible, it's really, really worst case scenarios, this shouldn't stop us from acting immediately and really taking quite drastic action to prevent the possibility of these sorts of worst case scenarios. You also saw this historically when talking about potentially toxic chemicals. So there have been several cases in the past in which there might be a chemical, let's say, that's already on the market, and then some evidence arises that this might be toxic to the people who are using it. And there have been several cases in the past where we've said, oh, look, we're not sure yet even how likely this is. Let's wait and gather more evidence before taking action. And this has gone quite badly in the past. So now the idea is, so we can maybe sum up the precautionary principle by saying, better safe than sorry. Better to just act now. We really don't want people to be poisoned by something. So just take it off the market. Don't wait and gather further evidence before making the decision. So Matthias and I thought, particularly at the start of the pandemic, the precautionary approach seems like kind of a natural justification for lockdown restriction. We have the same combination of characteristics, uncertainty, and really severe consequences. But when we really dig into the precautionary principle and try to specify it a little bit more, it's very difficult to find a formulation that can justify the decision to impose lockdowns early on. Why is this? Because when we apply the precautionary principles to situations where there are significant risks on both sides, this leads to a so-called problem of paralysis. So if we think of the essence of the precautionary principle as we really need to avoid the worst possible outcome, we need to take action to avert catastrophe, This is going to be a problem when the suggested measures that we're considering implementing themselves might lead to really severe or catastrophic consequences. And we saw this kind of echoed in the early debate on lockdown. Some people were saying, look, we need to implement the lockdowns. Yes, it's true, you know, we're not sure, this evidence is very uncertain, but we need to avert catastrophe. And then you had people on the other side saying, look, you know, we have reason to believe that implementing these measures in themselves could cause catastrophic outcomes. It's going to have very severe social and economic consequences. So just a stipulation, act even under uncertainty to avoid catastrophe doesn't seem to give us coherent advice here. We could see it as recommending both for and against implementing any measures that are really stringent and severe. So this could apply to climate change as well. The type of mitigation measures that we would need to implement could also have really severe consequences as a result of implementing the measures. So our question is, how can we formulate an action guiding precautionary principle that doesn't generate paralysis in situations where there are significant risks on both sides? So what I'm going to do today is look at two influential formulations of the precautionary principle, one from Stephen Gardner, which comes more from the side of ethics, and one from Daniel Steele, that's more rooted in philosophy of science. And I'm going to argue that each approach cannot effectively avoid the problem of paralysis for these situations that we're interested in, really where there are significant risks on both sides. And then I'm going to suggest an amendment, which I think will allow both theories to generate consistent recommendations. And this will be based on an asymmetry of control between the possible courses of action, how much control we retain over what happens in the future. So both Steele and Gardner start by noting that when we're trying to formulate a precautionary principle, we're faced with a dilemma. So on the one side, we don't want our precautionary principle to be too vague or vacuous. For example, we might all be able to agree that scientific uncertainty should not prevent us from taking action to avoid a credible risk of harm. But this, as a formulation of a concrete principle, doesn't give us much of an indication at all about precisely what action to take in a specific situation. But if we try to make the principle more specific, more action guiding, we quickly run into problems of incoherence or paralysis. If we try to make it more concrete, for example, and this comes from Steele, by suggesting that any activity that presents a credible threat of serious harm should be prohibited, we can see again, this is going to recommend both for and against the implementation of any non-trivial, particularly very serious, stringent measures with potential sort of negative consequences of their own. Now, one way out of this dilemma might be to focus only on certain types of harm. So we could say, look, what we're concerned with here are environmental harms or public health harms. And then sort of, we're not talking here about economic or social harms. Let's just put those to the side. But this seems like a very unsatisfactory response. And we saw this a lot, if you recall, with the debate on the pandemic. A lot of people were saying, look, you're focusing too much here on epidemiology, but you're not taking into account all these other sort of economic and social ills that could result by the measures you're proposing. If we want the precautionary principles sort of work here to be action guiding, we will want it to be comprehensive. And this is something that Gardner insists on as well. So what does he suggest we should do? How should we avoid this problem of paralysis? Gardner proposes that we take a Rawlsian-inspired approach. He starts off by noting the similarity between the maxi-min principle from Rawls and precautionary reasoning. So maxi-min is about maximizing the minimum. It's really concerned with working out what's the worst possible scenario and how do we avoid it. This is exactly what we're trying to do with precautionary reasoning. And Rawls's maxi-min principle is also intended to be implemented under uncertainty. So it seems like they're both getting to something quite similar here. But there's a problem with maxi-min. It can be implausibly risk-averse in many different situations. And this is something that Rawls notes himself. So for example, imagine that it's a lovely summer's day outside, and my friends are across the road in the park having a picnic lunch. Now I could stay at home or I could go and join them in the park. But as I cross the street outside, there's a very small chance that I might be hit by a car and killed. Now, if I only care about avoiding this worst case scenario, it would just suggest that I should stay indoors. But this doesn't seem like a good principle. It really seems to be generating an unintuitive consequence here. So Rawls says, yes, this is right. Maximum isn't going to work in all circumstances. What we should do is place restrictions on when it should be used. It should only be used when certain conditions are met. And basically what Gardner is proposing is, let's do the same for the precautionary principle. Maybe we can use Rawls's restrictions for maxi-min and use these to work out when we should use precautionary reasoning to justify certain courses of action. So here are the three restrictions that Rawls puts on maxi-min. He says we should only use maxi-min in situations first, where the knowledge of likelihoods is impossible or at best extremely insecure. So here he's just saying in different words that there should be a situation of uncertainty in the way I've defined it. Second, the decision makers must care relatively little for potential gains above the minimum guaranteed by the maxi-min approach. So where we really have a lot to lose by implementing certain measures, this might not be a case where we should use maxi-min, or for Gardner also the precautionary principle. And third, rejected alternatives have outcomes that one can hardly accept. So this is Rawls' way of expressing this idea that these should really be catastrophic consequences. So these should really be sort of outcomes that societally we just cannot accept. We really cannot allow this to happen. So this is Gardner's proposal. Just restrict the scope of the precautionary principle, only use it when these three conditions are met. But in order to start to see the problem with what he's proposing, at least for our purposes, we can look at a challenge that Bjorn Lomborg makes to action on climate change. So Lomborg says, among other things, that we should care a great deal about the opportunity costs of climate mitigation. Now, Gardner discusses this, and he does question the veracity of this claim, but he also says, maybe we should understand what Lomborg is saying here is not as a challenge to the precautionary principle per se, but just a claim that condition 2 is not met in this case. So if we really have a lot to lose from implementing stringent measures against climate change, then this is just not a situation in which we care relatively little for potential gains. So maybe we should understand Lomborg as saying, not that there's a problem with the precautionary principle, but this is just a situation where the precautionary principle does not apply. So I think Gardner's proposal here does allow us to avoid the problem of paralysis. Effectively, what he's saying is that we should only use the precautionary principle when the measures it's recommending are pretty trivial, or at least don't really impose a significant cost. So we're never going to be faced with a situation where there are significant risks on both sides. But this really comes at a very high cost. We want to use the precautionary principle, particularly in these difficult cases, like climate change, like lockdowns, where the measures that we have to implement really do involve significant costs of their own. So our next question here is there a way of widening the scope? Can we use the precautionary principle as well to justify non-trivial measures? And in order to see if there's a relevant difference here that might allow us to do this, let's return to the 23rd of March 2020. So this was the day in the UK in which many measures were implemented, including the closure of businesses, the dispersal of gatherings of more than 2 people, and restrictions on when you can leave the house. So these measures, among others, are sort of collectively referred to as lockdown measures. So this government decision came a couple of days after SAGE, the UK's Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies, looked at the now notorious Report 9. This was the modelling report that gave these sort of proposed scenarios for what would happen if we failed to implement any measures or implemented various combinations of measures. And basically, Report 9 projected that hospital capacity would be exceeded, and I quote, many times over in a matter of weeks, unless all these measures were implemented. SAGE also observed that the virus appeared to be spreading exponentially in the UK, and it seemed to be following the same trajectory as several other countries, including Italy, whose hospital capacity had already been exceeded by this time. Now, SAGE explicitly, in the notes of their meeting, they explicitly and repeatedly note that the evidence they're looking at is limited and uncertain. But very rarely for SAGE, they issue an unequivocal recommendation that schools should be closed as soon as possible. So just a couple of days after this meeting is March 23, where the first lockdown measures were implemented in the UK. So here we have a situation in which there was some evidence of looming catastrophe, so both modelling evidence, but also some other evidence, but it's very clear that this evidence was highly uncertain. It's clear also that the recommended measures had potentially catastrophic consequences of their own. Even at this stage, we could see the kinds of drastic consequences that could result from these lockdown measures. This is clearly not a case in which we care little for gains. So was there a relevant difference between implementing the measures and failing to implement them? We think that there was a potentially pertinent difference between these two courses of action. There was reason to think that a failure to lock down could result in an uncontrollable catastrophe, whereas we could potentially act later to avoid the catastrophic consequences of lockdown. So what I'm referring to here is in the modelling report, Report 9, they suggest that basically the virus is spreading exponentially. There's a certain window in which you can implement measures and sufficiently contain the spread of the virus. But after a few weeks, the virus will have spread to enough people that anything you do after that point will fail to contain the spread. So after this, if it's true that we're on this trajectory to hospital systems being overwhelmed many times over, there will be no possibility for action after this small window. This catastrophic consequence will be inevitable. If we're on the side, however, where we implement lockdowns and they look to be heading towards a sort of worst case scenario, to really poor educational outcomes, economic failure, these are situations in which we can intervene later, either with mitigation measures to try and soften the blow, so financial cushioning in some way, or if it seems that we're really heading to these worst case scenarios in this case, to roll back the lockdown measures. So there still seems to be a possibility in this scenario to intervene later and avoid the worst case scenario in this trajectory. So we thus suggest that we can modify Gardner's account as follows to widen the scope of the precautionary principle and allow it to be used in cases where there are significant risks on both sides. So we suggest let's take the care little for gains condition and let's modify it as follows. Failing to take precautionary measures makes the occurrence of possible catastrophic outcomes uncontrollable, while possible catastrophic outcomes resulting from precautionary measures are still open to being controlled through later actions. Now, there's nothing in this new principle that contradicts the original principle too, so this could be combined disjunctively. We could say either we care little for gains, or there needs to be this asymmetry between the courses of action open to us. But this is something that might allow us to deal with these high risks on both sides cases. But there are potentially other ways of avoiding the problem of paralysis. Daniel Steele provides us with an alternate approach to the precautionary principle, which he explicitly has designed to apply to high-stakes situations. Now, Daniel Steele wrote an entire book about the precautionary principle. He has a very sophisticated and kind of difficult to explain in a short amount of time approach to the principle. But basically, he suggests that the precautionary principle should be understood as an abstract argument scheme consisting of a knowledge condition, a harm condition, and a recommended precaution. And the idea is different ways of specifying each of these conditions, so really setting them and making them concrete, will result in different concrete versions of the precautionary principle, which are appropriate to different circumstances and contexts. So the amount of knowledge we might require in one scenario might be different to the amount of knowledge we require in a different scenario. So on this abstract level, it's kind of difficult to see what he's getting at, but maybe we can get a clearer idea of seeing how he comes to, how he recommends we come to a specific decision guiding rule appropriate for a particular context. He basically suggests we do this through what he calls a requirement of proportionality. This has two parts, a requirement of consistency and a requirement of efficiency. I'll just talk about consistency today, or we can discuss efficiency later if it comes up. So Steele's requirement of consistency suggests that a precaution should not be precluded by the same version of the precautionary principle used to justify it. So this is just basically another way of saying avoid the problem of paralysis. If you're trying to put a particular version of the precautionary principle forward to justify something, and it's also recommending against the precaution, then something is going wrong here. So let's take, for example, imagine someone wants to justify banning the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine with a precautionary principle. And they put forward the following concrete principle. They suggest, if it is possible that an activity will lead to serious harm, then that activity should be prohibited. So we can see here, now we have the knowledge condition specified, if it is possible, the harm condition, serious harm, and the recommended action. The activity should be prohibited. So say someone's trying to ban the MMR vaccine, and they say, look, it's possible that the MMR vaccine will lead to serious harm. So we should ban the MMR vaccine. Does this work? No, because banning the MMR vaccine will also possibly lead to serious harm. So again, we've got the problem of paralysis. We're generating inconsistent recommendations here. This chosen principle recommends both for and against the proposed course of action. So for Steele, it fails the test of consistency. So how do we pass the test of consistency? Steele says that a precaution can be recommended by a precautionary principle if first, there is an adequate version of the precautionary principle that consistently recommends the precaution, and second, no adequate version of the precautionary principle consistently recommends any action other than the precaution. So we need a version of the precautionary principle that only recommends for, and no adequate version that only recommends against. Okay, so this is kind of difficult to do, but we wanted to see what Steele's precautionary principle might say about lockdowns. Now it's difficult because there are lots of different formulations of the principle, right? We can specify each of these, the knowledge, the harm, and the recommended activity in various different ways. But let's take as our starting point three proposals that Steele makes. So these are three concrete suggestions he makes for adequate precautionary principles. So to kind of have these conditions specified. So first, if there is some scientific evidence that an activity leads to a significant and irreversible harm, then an alternative should be substituted for that activity if feasible. Two, if a scientifically plausible mechanism exists, whereby an activity can lead to catastrophe, then that activity should be phased out or significantly restricted. And third, if it is possible that an activity will lead to catastrophe, then that activity should be prohibited. Now, let's just take the first principle to start off with and see what it might say about lockdowns. So as we've seen, we had some scientific evidence that failing to impose lockdowns would lead to significant and irreversible harm. But arguably, as we've also seen, there was also evidence that some of the social and economic consequences of lockdown measures would also result in significant harm, and harm that, if it were to obtain, would be irreversible. Moreover, it was not obvious, once we take the long-term effects of lockdown into account, that harms resulting from lockdown are any less catastrophic in terms of life years lost or overall economic costs, which means that the implementation of lockdowns would trigger the harm conditions in versions 2 and 3 as well. So in these versions, we require catastrophe, but I think a good argument could be made that catastrophe could exist on both sides of this equation as well. So it might be possible to find a specific combination of these three, the harm condition, the knowledge condition, and the recommended precaution, that could make a consistent recommendation here. But the potential problem here is that this could really require the kind of precise scientific evidence that just was not available early in the pandemic. The point of the precautionary principle is it's supposed to be used under uncertainty. If we have the precise scientific information that can really lead us to sort of assign probabilities to the various outcomes, then we can use a different tool. We can do something like a cost-benefit analysis. So if we're using the precautionary principle, we really need it to be something we can implement under uncertainty. So we need to set these conditions without having detailed scientific knowledge. So it might also just be the case that lockdown measures like banning the MMR vaccine cannot be justified by Steele's precautionary principle. When we look at can we justify lockdowns with these three formulations, it seems like we're always running into this problem of paralysis. But I think that the problem goes deeper than this. And that's because no formulation seems to be able to recommend any course of action. And that's because for Steele, consistency excludes ineffectual precautions. So let's just return to these three concrete versions of the precautionary principle and think through all our options. When we were policymakers, let's say, faced with the decision, the initial decision, do we implement lockdowns in March 2020? So our first option is just to do nothing. Now, this is something that would be recommended against by all formulations. There was some scientific evidence that failing to implement lockdowns would lead to significant and irreversible harm. It was scientifically plausible that it could lead to catastrophe, and obviously then it was also clear that it was possible that it could lead to catastrophe. So it seems like doing nothing is recommended against by all formulations. There's a possibility that we could implement the measures, but again, as we've already seen, this is recommended both for and against by all formulations. So it generates paralysis for each of these formulations. Then I guess we can have a third option. Maybe we just implement some of the measures. Maybe we see how it goes, and then we can implement more if this seems like it's actually sort of working, having a desired effect, or if it's not having sort of really bad consequences that we might anticipate. But as we've seen, report 9 suggested that anything short of implementing all the measures within a very short window would be akin to doing nothing. So if we did not sort of take full action within this short period of time, then they projected we would be faced with the worst case scenario we were trying to avoid. So in this case, it's not just significant amount of deaths, but the hospital systems being overwhelmed. This was the option that, according to policymakers, just could not be entertained, could not be accepted. So the problem here is that Steele's suggestions don't seem to be able to provide us with any consistent recommendation in the lockdown case. Can we generate a consistent recommendation with Steele's approach? We argue that we can, if again, we incorporate this asymmetry of control. So here's an alternate formulation of the second principle I presented you with. If a scientifically plausible mechanism exists whereby an activity can lead to a catastrophe, and failing to take precautionary measures makes the occurrence of the catastrophe uncontrollable, then that activity should be phased out or significantly restricted. This principle can generate a consistent recommendation. What is it? Implement the measures now in full force, monitor the situation, and if it looks like we're heading towards the worst case scenario, then either implement mitigation measures or, if necessary, roll back the measures. Now, I focus very heavily on the lockdown case here, but we're interested in this scenario also because what it might be able to tell us about similar cases with the same sort of set of circumstances where there's an urgent need to do something and we're doing it under uncertainty. So we think that this is also relevant for the climate case, which we've already discussed, that this asymmetry also obtains in this case. And this is because many changes to the climate system are associated with what's called a tipping point. And this is basically a point at which, once you've passed the tipping point, further action cannot prevent sort of worst case scenario. So one example of this is that once the ice shields become unstable, it doesn't matter if you slightly reduce the global surface temperature after that, this cannot be reversed in a human timescale. So it seems like there might be a parallel between these two scenarios. Unless we take drastic mitigation measures in the very near future, we face uncontrollable climate change with potentially catastrophic consequences for human civilization. And in contrast, the potentially catastrophic consequences of the really severe mitigation measures that might be required allow for some degree of control. There are sort of no tipping points in this scenario that we have to be worried about crossing. So, for example, if we drastically scale down the use of fossil fuels, and this leads to an energy crisis where many people can't get their basic needs met, it's still possible to step up the use of fossil fuels. Obviously, in this scenario, damage will be done, but the truly worst case scenario, it's still possible to avoid it, or at least we don't have the same reason to believe that it can't be avoided in the way that we do when we're facing a tipping point. We can identify a tipping point that once it's crossed, there's no possibility for action anymore. So to just summarize what I've said, precautionary measures are often appealed to justify intervention to stave off serious yet uncertain threats of harm. But attempts to formulate an adequate precautionary principle run into trouble when precautionary measures have potentially severe consequences of their own. By recognizing and incorporating an asymmetry of control into Steele and Gardner's formulations of the precautionary principle, we can, we think, generate coherent guidance and avoid the problem of paralysis. This makes sense of the lockdown measures in the early pandemic as a coherent precautionary response. And I should note here, we're not trying to retroactively justify the actual actions that policymakers took or sort of suggest that this was in their minds when they took this action. We're suggesting it could be used as a justification under these types of circumstances for these types of actions. But also this might have wider implications for example, responses to climate change. Thank you.